the quiet beginning of a healing journey. The night was calm, almost deceptively so, the kind of calm that settles over a city when the noise of the day finally loosens its grip. Los Angeles breathed slowly under a pale sky, streetlights glowing like patient witnesses. To the outside world, everything looked unchanged. But inside Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves, storms of silence lived, quiet, heavy, and unseen. People had always seen Sandra as resilient. She was admired, celebrated, and often described as someone who carried strength effortlessly. Interviews showed her smiling, poised, gracious. But strength, when worn for too long, can become exhausting. In the privacy of her own life, recent heartache had settled into her days like an uninvited shadow. It wasn't dramatic enough for headlines, nor loud enough to demand attention. It was the kind of pain that simply lingered, persistent, dull, and deeply personal. Some mornings, she woke feeling as though she had already given everything she had, with nothing left to refill herself. Keanu carried his own quiet scars. He had long learned how to move through the world without noise, without spectacle. His kindness was often praised, but few understood where it came from. It was not a personality trait polished for public admiration. It was a survival skill shaped by loss. He had learned over years marked by grief that gentleness was sometimes the only way to keep moving forward. Pain had taught him humility, and humility had taught him compassion. Yet even compassion did not erase loneliness. Neither of them spoke loudly about their struggles. They respected the world too much to turn private pain into public currency. They believed that some things deserved silence, not secrecy, but dignity. And yet, life has a strange way of placing two souls together precisely when they need each other most, without asking permission or offering explanation. It began one evening that felt entirely ordinary. Sandra, worn down by a long day that demanded more energy than she had, stepped into a small coffee shop tucked away from the louder streets of Los Angeles. The door closed softly behind her, sealing out the rush of the city. The warmth inside wrapped around her, scented with roasted beans and quiet conversations. She wanted nothing grand, just a moment of peace, perhaps a cup of tea, and a few minutes where she didn't have to be anyone at all. Her mind, however, refused to rest. Memories she tried to push away returned uninvited. Trust once given too freely, words once believed too deeply, and the slow realization that love, when broken, does not shatter cleanly. It cracks unevenly, leaving sharp edges behind. She stood in line, hands folded, breathing slowly as if that alone might steady her heart. Then she heard a voice behind her. It was soft, gentle, unmistakably familiar. She turned, and there he was, Keanu waiting in line like any other man, dressed simply, his presence calm and unassuming. There was no dramatic greeting, no surprise fit for cameras. Just a shared pause, a recognition that felt deeper than coincidence. He smiled at her, not the kind of smile meant for the world, but the kind that said, "I see you," even when you say nothing. "It's been a while," he said quietly. "Too long," Sandra replied, her voice steady, though something fragile moved beneath it. They didn't plan to sit together. It simply happened as though the silence between them had asked for company. They chose a small table near the window, the city lights blurred by glass. Outside, life rushed on, unaware that something subtle was unfolding inside. Sandra wrapped her hands around her cup, not for the drink but for the warmth. Keanu noticed. He noticed the way her eyes drifted, how her thoughts seemed distant, pulled toward places she hadn't named. He didn't press her with questions. He understood silence too well to interrupt it unnecessarily. Sometimes silence is not emptiness. Sometimes it is where healing waits, patient and unseen. This was the quiet hook of their journey, not two famous faces sharing coffee, but two human beings carrying invisible weight, sitting across from each other without pretending they weren't tired. Pain had broken them in different ways, but kindness, humility, and respect were quietly preparing to rebuild something neither of them expected. As the evening stretched, Sandra finally spoke, her words careful, almost fragile. "Do you ever feel like the world expects you to be strong every single day?" she asked. "Like if you stop being strong even for a moment, you're letting everyone down." Keanu looked at her, really looked at her, his eyes holding a depth that came from understanding rather than judgment. "Every day," he said simply. "But I learned something along the way. Strength isn't about pretending you're okay. Sometimes strength is just letting someone sit with you while you're not." Her eyes filled before she could stop it. No one had said it to her that plainly before. No solutions, no speeches, just permission. In that moment, she understood why Keanu had always felt different. He didn't try to fix pain. He didn't rush toward answers. He made room. Minutes passed without urgency. They watched the world through the window, sharing silence that felt strangely safe. Sandra thought about her recent heartache, how much she had given, how deeply she had trusted, and how quietly she had lost herself in the process. Keanu thought of his own griefs, the people he had loved and lost, the nights when memory felt heavier than sleep. Their stories were not the same, but the emotions overlapped like echoes. Both knew loneliness, both knew disappointment, both knew what it felt like to smile for others while wishing to disappear for a while. Then something small happened, something that would stay with them longer than they realized. A young boy entered the cafe with his mother, clutching a sketchbook pressed close to his chest. He moved carefully, as if unsure of his place in the room. Sandra smiled at him instinctively, and after a moment of shy hesitation, he stepped closer and showed her a drawing. It was of two figures standing side by side, strong in posture, but with tears drawn carefully beneath their eyes. Sandra's chest tightened. "Why are they crying?" she asked gently. The boy shrugged, then answered with quiet certainty, "Because even heroes need to cry sometimes." Keanu and Sandra exchanged a look. No words were necessary. The truth had arrived from an unexpected place, simple and undeniable. When they left the cafe later that night, something had shifted. Sandra felt lighter, not because her pain had disappeared, but because it had been acknowledged without being judged. Keanu walked beside her, not as a celebrity, not as a co-actor remembered by millions, but as a friend who respected her broken pieces. And sometimes that is the first step toward healing. Neither of them knew it yet, but this quiet meeting would lead to moments of deep conflict, emotional trials, and choices that would test their resilience in ways neither expected. Their journey was only beginning, unfolding not in grand declarations, but in silence, humility, and the raw truth of being human. The days that followed carried a different weight. Sandra found herself thinking about that cafe again and again. It wasn't the place that stayed with her, it was the words. Sometimes strength is just letting someone sit with you while you're not okay. The sentence echoed in her mind like a quiet invitation. It wasn't advice. It wasn't pressure. It was permission. Yet when she returned home, the silence there felt heavier. Empty rooms have a way of amplifying thoughts, and without distraction, memories returned more easily. Still, something had changed. The silence no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a space, one that could be shared. This was the deeper question beginning to form beneath the surface. What happens when two people who know each other's faces, but not each other's wounds, begin walking toward those wounds together? What happens when silence becomes a bridge instead of a wall? Sandra had spent years being the bright presence on screen, the voice of warmth and humor. But behind the camera there were scars from broken trust and nights spent questioning her own worth. Keanu lived differently, quietly, without chasing attention, but his kindness had been forged in loss. His compassion was not soft, it was disciplined, shaped by experience. Two different wounds, one shared understanding. A week after the cafe, Sandra received a message from Keanu. It was brief, gentle, and unassuming. "There's a quiet bookstore near Westwood. Want to join me for a walk?" She hesitated, feeling the familiar urge to retreat. But another voice, quieter, braver, reminded her of the boy's drawing, of the permission she had been given. She replied with a single word. "Yes." And with that, their healing journey took its first deliberate step forward, still unseen by the world, still fragile, but undeniably real. When silence learns to speak. The days after the bookstore invitation unfolded slowly, like a careful hand turning the pages of a book that mattered too much to rush. For Sandra Bullock, something subtle but unmistakable had shifted. The pain was still there, present in quiet moments and unguarded thoughts, but it no longer felt as isolating as it once had. There was now the awareness that somewhere in the same city, Keanu Reeves was also navigating his own silence, not as a distant figure admired from afar, but as someone walking a parallel path. That knowledge alone softened the sharpest edges of her loneliness. They met at the bookstore in the late afternoon, when sunlight filtered through tall windows and dust floated in the air like memories suspended in time. The place felt untouched by urgency, sheltered from the noise of schedules and expectations. Keanu stood near a wooden shelf, running his fingers slowly along the spines of old books, as though greeting old friends. Sandra watched him for a moment before he noticed her, struck by how comfortable he seemed in stillness. When he turned and smiled, it wasn't a greeting meant to impress. It was an invitation to exhale. Their conversation began without direction. They spoke of words that had stayed with them over the years, of lines read long ago that resurfaced during moments of grief. Keanu opened a thin poetry book, its pages worn soft by time, and read quietly, "Grief is love with nowhere to go." The words hung between them, heavy but honest. Sandra felt her throat tighten, not from sadness alone, but from recognition. After a pause, she answered softly, "Then maybe healing is learning where to let that love go again." It wasn't something she had planned to say. It arrived fully formed, as if her heart had been waiting for permission to speak. The bookstore seemed to listen with them, its silence respectful rather than empty. Yet life, even in places of calm, has a way of reminding people that pain does not exist in isolation. A sudden voice broke the stillness when a man at the counter raised his tone, anger spilling out over a missing order. The tension rippled through the room, snapping Sandra back into old reflexes. Her shoulders stiffened, her breath caught, and memories of raised voices from her own past flickered uninvited. Before she could retreat inward, Keanu moved, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with deliberate calm. He approached the man and spoke quietly, his voice steady and unthreatening. He didn't defend the store or challenge the frustration. He simply acknowledged the feeling behind it, reminding the man that disappointment often carries more weight than the situation itself. Something softened in the man's posture. His anger drained away, replaced by embarrassment and fatigue. The room exhaled. Sandra watched the exchange with wide, thoughtful eyes. When they stepped back outside, she finally asked him how he managed to remain so composed in moments like that. Keanu didn't answer immediately. He walked a few steps, letting the question breathe before saying, "Because I've been the one shouting too. I know what it feels like to be hurt and not know where to put it. Patience is something I learned because I needed it once, and someone gave it to me." His words landed with quiet force. Sandra realized that his calm was not natural ease. It was practiced compassion, born from understanding rather than superiority. That night alone in her home, Sandra sat with her thoughts instead of fleeing from them. She opened a journal she hadn't touched in months and wrote without censoring herself, letting truths spill onto the page. She wrote about how pain had taught her to protect herself too fiercely, how independence had become both her shield and her cage. She wrote about Keanu's words, about how being strong all the time had left her exhausted. By the time she closed the journal, the silence in the room felt different. It no longer pressed down on her, it held her. What she didn't expect was the message that arrived the next morning. It came from a number she didn't recognize, brief and unadorned. "He talks about you," it read. "He says you reminded him that he's not alone either." Sandra stared at the screen, her heart beating faster. She didn't ask who sent it. She didn't need to. The meaning mattered more than the source. For the first time since her heartache, she realized something profound. Healing was no longer something she was receiving passively. She was participating in it, sharing it, offering it back. Their connection deepened quietly over the following weeks, built from walks rather than declarations, from shared moments instead of promises. They met in places that allowed them to remain human rather than visible, parks in the early morning, small diners late at night, long drives without destination. They spoke about loss, but not with drama. They spoke about fear not as weakness, but as something that deserved acknowledgement. Each conversation peeled back another layer, revealing not perfection but honesty. Yet healing, once it begins, often invites the past to test its strength. Sandra's test arrived on a rainy evening, sudden and unwelcome. She had just returned home when her phone lit up with a name she hadn't seen in a long time. Her breath caught instantly. The message was simple, apologetic, and dangerous in its simplicity. "I'm sorry for everything. Can we meet?" The room seemed to tilt as memories rushed back, sharp and intrusive. She sat down slowly, pressing the phone against her chest, torn between anger, fear, and a lingering desire for answers she had never received. When she told Keanu the next day, her voice was barely above a whisper. They sat in a small diner, bowls of soup growing cold between them. She confessed her confusion, the pull of unfinished business, the exhaustion of carrying unanswered questions. Keanu didn't tell her what to do. He asked her what she wanted. When she admitted she didn't know, he said something that stayed with her long after the conversation ended. "Sometimes the questions hurt more than the answers we're afraid of. But whatever you choose, you don't have to face it alone." The meeting happened days later in a crowded cafe, noisy enough to feel anonymous but not enough to feel safe. Sandra sat waiting, hands trembling, her heart pounding against her ribs. Keanu was nearby, not at her table, but present in the room, a silent anchor. When the man arrived, regret etched into his face, apologies poured out too quickly, too late. Sandra listened without interruption, feeling emotions rise and fall like waves. And then, when she finally spoke, her voice surprised even her. She didn't forgive him, and she didn't attack him. She told him simply that she no longer needed his remorse to move forward. She needed only the knowledge that she could walk away without carrying his shadow. She stood and left, her legs unsteady but her resolve intact. Outside, rain blurred the city into soft shapes. Keanu stepped beside her and offered an umbrella without a word. As they walked together, she admitted that she didn't feel healed, but she felt lighter. Keanu nodded, telling her that sometimes freedom begins not with forgiveness, but with release. What Sandra didn't know yet was that while she had faced her past, Keanu's was quietly waiting its turn. A letter arrived at his apartment days later, handwritten, its presence alone enough to unsettle him. He didn't open it immediately. He carried it with him, feeling its weight grow heavier with each passing hour. He didn't want to burden Sandra, not after what she had endured. But she noticed the change in him, the distance in his eyes, the way his smile faded too quickly. When she finally asked him what he was carrying, he didn't deflect. He placed the unopened letter between them, his hand resting on it as though it might disappear if he let go. Sandra looked at him steadily and said, "Then let me sit with you while you face it." In that moment, their journey shifted again. Healing was no longer something one offered while the other received. It had become shared ground, a space where both could be vulnerable without fear. As Keanu slowly opened the envelope, the room seemed to hold its breath. Neither of them knew what the words inside would bring, release or rupture, peace or pain. But they understood something essential now. Healing was not a single moment or a finished destination. It was a process, one that required courage, patience, and the willingness to let someone else witness the parts of you that had always been hidden. And as the letter unfolded in his hands, both of them sensed that the next chapter of their journey would demand even more honesty than the last, testing not just their resilience, but the trust they were quietly building between them. The letter that opened the past. The room was unusually still as Keanu Reeves sat with the opened letter resting in his hands. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as though it carried years instead of words. Outside, traffic murmured in the distance, the city continuing its rhythm without pause, unaware that something deeply personal was unfolding behind closed doors. Sandra Bullock sat close by, not crowding him, not touching him, but present in the way that mattered most. Her presence was steady, grounded, offering silent permission for whatever emotions might surface next. The letter did not begin with accusation or blame. It began with forgiveness. Those words alone were enough to fracture the calm Keanu had spent years carefully constructing. His breath faltered, and for a moment he could not continue reading. The letter was written by someone connected to one of the deepest losses of his life, a loss he had carried quietly, believing that responsibility was his burden to bear alone. As his eyes moved slowly across the page, the words unfolded like a confession long delayed. The writer admitted to years of anger, years of misplaced blame, and the slow realization that grief, when left unattended, poisons everything it touches. The forgiveness offered was not only for Keanu, but for the writer himself, a release born from exhaustion rather than resolution. Keanu's hands trembled as he finished reading. For a long time, he said nothing. The silence between them was thick, but it was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that follows truth, when words have done all they can and emotion must catch up. Finally, his voice broke the stillness, barely above a whisper. He admitted that he had spent years believing that holding on to guilt was a form of loyalty, that if he punished himself enough, the memory of what he lost would remain alive and untouched. Letting go, he feared, would feel like betrayal. Sandra listened, her eyes reflecting a depth of understanding shaped by her own losses. She told him gently that memory does not disappear when guilt is released. It becomes lighter, more humane. That night stretched on without urgency. They spoke of how grief reshapes identity, how it quietly influences choices, relationships, and self-worth. Sandra shared how her own heartache had made her question not just others but herself, how she had learned to equate pain with personal failure. Keanu spoke of how solitude had become his refuge and his shield, protecting others from his sorrow but isolating him from connection. Their honesty was not dramatic or loud. It was careful, deliberate, as if both understood that vulnerability deserved patience. The days that followed felt different, not easier but clearer. Keanu carried the letter with him for a while, not out of fear but out of reflection. He began to notice how often he avoided moments that might stir memory, how he filled his days with movement to outrun stillness. Sandra noticed changes too, subtle but meaningful. He laughed more freely, paused less before speaking, and allowed moments of joy to arrive without immediately questioning their legitimacy. Healing did not erase the past, but it softened its grip. Sandra, in turn, found herself confronting truths she had long avoided. Watching Keanu face his pain with such quiet courage forced her to reconsider her own defenses. She had spent years building walls disguised as independence, believing that self-reliance meant never needing anyone. But sitting beside someone else's grief had taught her something unexpected. Strength did not diminish when shared, it multiplied. The realization unsettled her at first, challenging habits formed through necessity rather than choice. One afternoon, Sandra invited Keanu to join her at a community center she supported quietly, far from cameras and attention. The center was modest, filled with children whose lives had already demanded resilience far beyond their years. Laughter echoed through the halls, uneven but sincere. As they walked inside, Sandra explained that many of these children carried losses they did not yet have words for. Keanu listened, his expression thoughtful, as if recognizing something familiar in the air. They met a young girl sitting alone on the floor, drawing intently with crayons scattered around her. Sandra knelt beside her, introducing them gently. The girl showed them her drawing, a single figure standing in the rain, small beneath a vast sky. Keanu crouched down beside her and asked if he could draw too. Without hesitation, she nodded. He picked up a crayon and added another figure to the picture, standing next to the first, holding an umbrella. The girl studied the drawing for a long moment before smiling softly, a quiet victory that required no applause. Sandra watched the interaction with emotion tightening her chest. In that moment, she understood something profound. Healing was not confined to private spaces or shared secrets. It expanded outward, touching others in ways neither of them could control or predict. Later that evening, Sandra confessed that witnessing that moment had changed her perspective. She realized that pain, when transformed rather than hidden, could become a source of empathy rather than isolation. Keanu agreed, admitting that helping others had always been his way of surviving, even when he hadn't fully understood why. But just as healing deepened, the outside world began to take notice. A photograph surfaced online, capturing Sandra and Keanu entering the community center together. The image spread quickly, stripped of context and layered with speculation. Headlines appeared, hinting at secrets and narratives that had nothing to do with truth. Whispers grew louder, curiosity sharpening into intrusion. Sandra felt the familiar tightening in her chest as she scrolled through her phone, reading assumptions made by people who knew nothing of their journey. Keanu faced the attention with practiced calm, but Sandra struggled more openly. Her life had already been lived under scrutiny, and the thought of having something so fragile exposed to public interpretation frightened her. Conversations with her management grew tense, filled with warnings about image and perception. She felt torn between protecting her privacy and honoring the authenticity she was finally allowing herself to live. The strain created distance, not through conflict, but through uncertainty. They spoke less for a few days, each retreating inward to process fears that words could not yet shape. Sandra questioned whether allowing someone so close had been a mistake, whether the cost of connection was simply too high. Keanu, in his quiet way, wrestled with the possibility that his presence might bring more complication than comfort into her life. Yet even in distance, their bond persisted. Sandra found herself thinking of the umbrella drawn by a child, of the way shared silence had once felt safe. Keanu replayed the moment Sandra had sat with him as he opened the letter, offering support without demand. Neither could ignore the truth they had already lived. What they shared was real, and fear alone could not undo it. The turning point came unexpectedly through a message from the community center. One of the children had been asking for Keanu, refusing to participate, withdrawing into herself. Sandra read the message slowly, her heart heavy with recognition. This was no longer about them. It was about responsibility born from connection. Without hesitation, she reached out to Keanu. When he answered, she didn't explain. She simply said, "They need you." His response was immediate and curt. "Then let's go." As they returned together, stepping once more into a space where kindness mattered more than perception, both understood that healing had carried them to a crossroads. They could retreat, protecting themselves from exposure, or they could continue forward, accepting that authenticity often comes with risk. Standing there, surrounded by children who had already learned the cost of silence, the choice felt clearer than it ever had before. What neither of them realized yet was that the next test would not come quietly. It would arrive publicly, demanding clarity and courage, forcing them to decide whether healing was something to be hidden or something worth standing for, even when the world was watching. When the world knocks too loudly. By the time the sun rose the morning after they returned to the community center, the quiet sanctuary Sandra and Keanu had built between themselves felt thinner. as if the outside world had begun pressing its weight against it. What had once been a shared silence filled with understanding now had to coexist with noise, speculation, expectations, and the relentless curiosity of people who mistook proximity for intimacy and kindness for confession. For Sandra Bullock, the pressure arrived first, sharp and insistent, in the form of phone calls that did not ask how she felt but told her what she should do. Her days filled with reminders that public life did not make room for nuance, that narratives were built quickly and rarely corrected, and that anything left unexplained would be explained for her by strangers. She listened in silence as voices advised distance, restraint, and appearances, each suggestion chipping away at the fragile sense of truth she had just begun to reclaim. Keanu, meanwhile, moved through the same noise with a different posture. For Keanu Reeves, public attention had long been something to pass through rather than confront. He understood that explanations often fed the very hunger they sought to satisfy, and he chose quiet over reaction, continuing his routines, avoiding statements, refusing to perform clarity for those unwilling to hear it. But calm did not mean unaffected. Beneath his composed exterior, he worried that the unwanted attention might pull Sandra back into the very isolation she had only just begun to escape, that his presence might become an anchor dragging rather than a hand steadying. The strain surfaced one evening as they sat together on Sandra's porch, the sky dimming into a bruised twilight. She spoke first, her voice tired, stripped of polish and patience. She admitted she was afraid, not of rumors themselves, but of what they could cost her children, her peace, the fragile stability she had fought to rebuild. She confessed that every camera flash felt like an accusation, every headline a reminder that privacy was a privilege she rarely possessed. Keanu listened without interruption, absorbing the weight of her fear, then asked quietly whether she wanted him to step back. The question landed heavily between them, not as an ultimatum, but as an act of respect. Sandra did not answer immediately, and the silence that followed felt sharper than any argument. What unfolded in that pause was not anger, but grief for the simplicity they had lost. Sandra finally admitted that she did not regret the connection they had formed. She regretted the cost of allowing the world to see it. Keanu nodded, understanding too well how visibility could distort intention. He told her that while the noise was real, so was what they had shared, and that fear, when allowed to decide, had a way of shrinking lives rather than protecting them. Yet even as he spoke, he understood that choice could not be made lightly, especially by someone whose life had already been so publicly consumed. In the days that followed, distance grew, not as rejection, but as reflection. Sandra immersed herself in work, long hours offering distraction from the questions she could not yet answer. Keanu retreated into motion, taking solitary rides through the city at night, the wind cutting through thoughts he could not quiet. Despite the space, neither could sever the thread that connected them. Memory returned unbidden. The cafe where silence first felt shared, the bookstore where words softened grief, the letter that had released years of guilt, the child's drawing that transformed loneliness into companionship. These moments refused to be reduced to rumors. They held too much truth. The turning point came not through confrontation, but through need. A message arrived from the community center late one afternoon, brief and concerned. One of the children had withdrawn again, refusing meals, asking repeatedly for the man who had drawn with her. Sandra read the message slowly, her chest tightening as she recognized the quiet plea beneath the words. This was not about headlines or fear. This was about responsibility born from connection. Without hesitation, she reached for her phone and called Keanu. When he answered, she did not explain the situation or apologize for the distance. She simply said they needed him. His response was immediate, certain, and unburdened by hesitation. Returning to the community center together felt different this time, as though the walls recognized them. The child's face lit up when she saw Keanu, her smile small but unmistakable. She showed them a new drawing, two figures under an umbrella, no longer dwarfed by rain, standing firm and close. Sandra felt tears rise, not from sadness, but from clarity. In that moment, she understood something that had eluded her before. What they had been building was not fragile because it was seen. It was fragile because it mattered. And things that matter are always worth protecting, even when protection requires courage rather than retreat. Later, as they stood outside watching the children play, Sandra spoke with a steadiness she hadn't felt in days. She told Keanu that hiding had not saved her in the past, that silence chosen out of fear was not the same as silence chosen with intention. She admitted that while the world's gaze frightened her, the thought of walking away from something rooted in honesty frightened her more. Keanu listened, his expression thoughtful, then replied that truth did not demand announcements or defenses. It demanded consistency. If they continued to live with kindness, respect, and humility, the rest would reveal itself in time. What neither of them could ignore now was that their journey had reached a threshold. The healing that began quietly between two people had grown outward, touching lives and inviting attention that could no longer be avoided. A decision loomed, not about defining their relationship for others, but about whether they would allow fear to dictate the shape of their lives. As they left the community center that evening, walking side by side beneath a sky clearing after rain, both sensed that the next chapter would ask even more of them. The world was watching, and the question was no longer whether they could endure the noise, but whether they could remain true to themselves while standing in its center. Standing in the open without armor. The invitation arrived quietly, almost politely, as though it understood the weight it carried. It was for a global humanitarian gathering focused on resilience, compassion, and the quiet work of rebuilding lives after loss. Sandra Bullock had been asked to speak about her long-standing advocacy, the kind she preferred to keep out of headlines. Keanu Reeves was invited for his consistent, unpublicized support of children's hospitals and community programs. On paper, it was a simple alignment of causes. In reality, it felt like a threshold neither of them had planned to cross together. The timing was too precise, the moment too charged, as if the world itself were asking whether the healing they had protected in private could survive the light. They talked about declining, more than once. There were good reasons to do so: fatigue, scrutiny, the knowledge that public spaces flatten complex truths into easy narratives. Sandra worried about the toll it might take on her children, about the possibility that kindness would be misread again as spectacle. Keanu worried about adding weight to a connection that had been built slowly and deliberately, fearing that attention might distort what was still becoming whole. Yet beneath those fears was a quieter realization neither could ignore. The healing they had found had already moved beyond secrecy. It had touched children, softened strangers, and changed the way they carried themselves through the world. Refusing the invitation would protect them, but it might also deny the truth of what had grown between them. The night of the event arrived with the usual pageantry: lights, cameras, murmured anticipation. But there was something different in the air, a restrained seriousness that suggested this was not an evening for performance. Backstage, Sandra stood still, breathing slowly, grounding herself in the familiar rhythm she used before stepping onto any stage. Keanu stood beside her, calm in the way that comes from acceptance rather than control. He told her they didn't owe the world explanations, only honesty. She nodded, understanding that honesty did not mean disclosure of everything, but alignment between what was said and how it was lived. When Sandra walked out to speak, the room settled into attentive silence. She spoke of the unseen work, of families rebuilding after quiet tragedies, of children learning to trust again, of how resilience often begins in moments too small to trend or headline. She spoke without embellishment, her voice steady not because she was unafraid, but because she had learned that truth does not need volume to be heard. As she spoke, she felt a shift within herself, a recognition that fear had lost some of its authority. The audience listened not because she was famous, but because what she said resonated with their own unspoken struggles. Then, without prelude or announcement, Keanu stepped onto the stage. It was not planned, not rehearsed, and not dramatic in the way people expected. He spoke briefly, his voice low and deliberate, about silence and the difference between hiding and healing. He admitted that for years he believed strength meant carrying pain alone, protecting others by keeping his grief contained. What he had learned, he said, was that silence becomes a cage when it is built from fear, and that real strength sometimes looks like allowing someone to sit beside you in the dark until your eyes adjust. The room responded not with shock but with recognition. Sandra felt it beside her, the collective stillness of people hearing something they had needed to hear for a long time. When she reached for his hand, it was not a statement. It was an instinct, the same one that had guided them through bookstores, cafes, and community centers. She spoke again, reminding the audience that resilience is not a performance and that kindness, when practiced consistently, reshapes not just individuals but communities. They did not define their bond. They did not correct rumors. They let the truth stand on its own. What followed surprised them both. The event shifted from speeches to shared stories as attendees, leaders, artists, volunteers began speaking openly about loss and recovery. The room transformed into a space of permission, where vulnerability was met with respect rather than judgment. In that moment, Sandra understood that the risk they had taken was not exposure, it was trust. Keanu understood that the healing he once guarded so closely could move freely without being diminished. Afterward, as they walked away from the lights, the noise returned, but it felt distant, less authoritative. Cameras flashed, questions floated toward them, and speculation resumed its predictable course. Yet something essential had changed. They were no longer reacting to the world's gaze, they were moving through it with intention. Sandra felt steadier than she had in months, not because the pressure had vanished, but because it no longer dictated her choices. Keanu felt lighter, as though the weight he had carried for years had finally learned how to rest. Later that night, away from the crowd, they talked honestly about what came next, not in terms of labels or declarations, but boundaries and values. They agreed that privacy would remain a form of respect, that kindness would remain the measure of their decisions, and that fear would no longer be the compass. They acknowledged that the path ahead would not be quiet, but it could still be truthful. As they parted for the night, there was no dramatic promise, only an understanding shaped by everything they had faced together. Healing had brought them to the open, not to be defined by others, but to define themselves through consistency and care. The journey that began in silence had found its voice, not loud, not defensive, but steady enough to be heard above the noise. And with that, they stepped forward into whatever came next, knowing that resilience once shared does not recede, it expands. The quiet becoming of what endures. In the days that followed the humanitarian gathering, the world continued exactly as it always had, talking, speculating, simplifying. Yet for Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves, something fundamental had settled into place. It was not relief because relief implies escape, and they had not escaped anything. It was not certainty because certainty demands guarantees the future never offers. What they felt instead was alignment, the quiet confidence that comes when actions finally match values. The healing that began as shared silence had matured into something sturdier, less fragile than fear and more honest than rumor. It did not need defending, it needed tending. Sandra noticed the change first in the smallest moments. She woke without the familiar weight pressing against her chest, not because her past had vanished, but because it no longer dictated the shape of her mornings. She moved through her days with a steadier rhythm, choosing work that nourished rather than distracted, conversations that clarified rather than consumed. When questions came, as they inevitably did, she answered with calm boundaries, refusing to trade truth for comfort or privacy for approval. The strength she had once performed had transformed into something quieter and far more reliable. It showed up in how she listened to her children, in how she protected their normalcy without retreating from the world, and in how she allowed joy to arrive without immediately bracing for its loss. Keanu experienced his own shift, one that surprised even him. The letter he had once carried like a talisman now rested in a drawer, no longer a burden but a marker of release. He found himself lingering in places he once passed through quickly, letting conversations unfold without rushing toward resolution. Grief still visited, grief always does, but it no longer arrived as accusation. It came as memory, softened by acceptance, no longer demanding penance. He understood now that honoring the past did not require perpetual suffering, and that love, when allowed to move forward, does not diminish what came before. They did not make announcements or declarations. Instead, they practiced consistency. They returned to the community center not as symbols but as participants, showing up when needed and stepping back when not. They listened more than they spoke, allowing children to lead conversations, allowing moments to remain unphotographed. When a child asked why they kept coming back, Sandra answered simply that some places remind you who you are. Keanu added that some people help you remember how to be gentle with yourself. The answers were enough. What surprised them both was how the noise outside gradually lost its urgency. Speculation persisted, as it always does, but it no longer felt personal. The world moved on to new curiosities, new assumptions, new distractions. What remained was what they had built deliberately: trust, patience, and the shared understanding that healing is not a destination reached once, but a practice renewed daily. They learned when to be present together and when to give each other space, respecting that independence and connection were not opposites, but partners. One evening, as they walked through a park at dusk, the sky dimming into a familiar blue, Sandra spoke about how she once believed healing meant returning to who she had been before pain arrived. She admitted she now understood that healing was about becoming someone new, someone informed by loss but not defined by it. Keanu agreed, saying that the person he was becoming felt more honest than the one he had tried to preserve. They laughed quietly at the realization that growth rarely announces itself. It reveals itself in hindsight, through choices that feel small in the moment and inevitable later. The final clarity came not through applause or affirmation, but through peace. Peace in knowing that they could walk side by side without needing to be named. Peace in understanding that kindness does not require witnesses to be real. Peace in accepting that the world would always simplify what it did not understand, and that understanding was not something they owed it. What mattered was how they treated the people in front of them, how they showed up when it counted, and how they honored the silence that first brought them together. As the night deepened, they stood for a moment beneath the trees, listening to the city settle around them. There was no promise spoken, no future outlined. There was only the shared certainty that whatever came next would be met with the same humility and care that had guided them this far. Their journey had never been about healing alone. It had been about learning how to remain human in a world that rewards performance. And in choosing that humanity, again and again, they had found something rarer than certainty and stronger than fear, a way forward that endured quietly and completely.